On This Week in Enterprise Tech, Recommind drops by to tell us all about Enterprise 101 for startups. We talk about whether or not it's a good idea for the government to sell off more spectrum. And hello, my name is a Spanish publisher. You delisted my site. Prepare to die.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Twyat. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 120, recorded December 15th, 2014. Enterprise 101 with Recommind. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by Techserv, the world's largest independent Apple retailer and professional services provider. Go to techserv.com/Twyat-7sins to get access to the free ebook on the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment. And by Braintree. If you're a developer or manager of a mobile app and searching for the right payments API, check out Braintree. Braintree's new V0 SDK makes it easy to support multiple mobile payment types with one simple integration. To learn more and to try out their sandbox, go to braintreepayments.com/twit. Welcome to Twyat This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. But of course, I'm not alone. Joining us on our journey are my good friends and co-hosts, starting with Mr. Brian Chee, the director of the Advanced Network Computing Laboratory in Honolulu, Hawaii, who happens to be on the left coast today. Cheebert, what are you doing here?
Hawaii weather's so boring. I had to come to someplace that had interesting weather, and then it started pouring on me.
Yes, it did. That's what we have for you. Rain. Speaking of rain, a man from the right coast, Mr. Curtis Franklin from Information Week Radio. Curtis, it's great to have you back. I'm sorry you can't be in the studio, but how are things out in Florida?
Well, Padre, my compensation for not being there with you is that there is no rain here in Florida. It's been a bright, beautiful Chamber of Commerce kind of day here in the Sunshine State.
Well, gentlemen, we've got an absolutely packed episode, so let's get right to it, starting with the blips. This one is all about Google shutting down their engineering offices in Russia. Now, late last week, Google announced that it would be shuttering engineering operations in Russia, even as it keeps sales and support. Such a move is not new for Google, having made similar moves in Finland and Sweden, but the decision is causing ripples as it was announced right after the passing of a Russian law that requires internet companies to hold data pertaining to Russians within a data center located inside of Russia. Insiders are suggesting that the search giant is pulling its engineering team out of Russia, akin to them partially pulling out of China to avoid Chinese censorship. Of course, Google closing the engineering office will not free them from the effects of the law, but it will make it more difficult for Russia to pressure them into compliance.
Hortonworks investors have hit it big, and oddly enough, that's important for you to know. We don't normally cover stock market stories here, but last week's Hortonworks IPO has some data that's useful for CIOs. The company, which specializes in Hadoop software, had an opening valuation of around $100 million. Then it went up by 65% during the day's trading. The reason analysts gave for the rise is that CIOs believe in the products. That is, they believe in Hadoop and big data. This is important because right now only about 4% of enterprises are making any serious use of Hadoop, and only about 20% are deep into pilots. All of this means that the people who are paid to know about these things think that there's still serious growth coming in the Hadoop market. That means the market for Hadoop skills and Hadoop applications will grow. And that means that you still have time to get serious about big data before your competitors use it to eat your market share lunch.
Twas the nightmare before Christmas. Automated pricing systems in some cases dropped items to 1 pence. Amazon and several small and medium-sized resellers are scrambling to save some companies from bankruptcy when hundreds of stock items were accidentally reduced to 1 pence that set off a buying spree by consumers. Some fingers are pointing at Repricer Express, who has previously boasted the ridiculously simple way to increase your Amazon holiday sales. Yeah, 1 pence. The bottom line is that the automated systems to do pricing needs to be rethought before the Grinch steals Christmas from UK resellers.
Well, how about this? Azure is getting a performance boost. Users of Microsoft's Azure services will see either previews or full offerings of Redmond's latest performance boost for their cloud-based products. Users running VMs in the Azure cloud can now opt for premium storage, which permanently attaches the virtual machine to up to 32 terabytes of ultra-fast, ultra-low latency SSD storage. The SSD ORAMA will be a big boost for customers running databases and other high I/O operations, giving them up to 50,000 IOPS and 2 gigabits per second of throughput. Microsoft is also releasing a feature that can package in-house systems into the cloud for running on Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android devices, as well as Azure AD Proxy, which will finally allow single sign-on between local and cloud-based services.
Well, the Apple-IBM partnership is beginning to bear fruit. Remember when IBM and Apple announced their big enterprise partnership? Well, last week, they finally announced the first applications from that partnership, and the apps look pretty good. The first 10 apps focus on vertical markets ranging from commercial air transit to law enforcement. And say, did you notice that United Airlines announced last week that they would be giving every flight attendant an iPhone 6 Plus? Coincidence? Probably not. IBM says that they'll be releasing 10 new apps every quarter in 2015, and there's a real chance that you'll see more enterprises announcing iOS adoption around those releases. It's amazing to say, but Apple has become the largest personal computing device vendor for enterprises without ever marketing to enterprise customers.
Well, the Skype translator preview goes live today. If you've ever wondered what Skype got out of the acquisition besides gobs of cash, well, the Skype preview of on-the-fly written and spoken translation should answer that. I've seen demos of Microsoft translation systems in the past, with the Chinese press giving the system a standing ovation for the amazing nuances of the translation to Cantonese. Now, test schools in America and Mexico are giving it a whirl, and very soon you will be able to also. Thank you, Microsoft, for helping to shrink the world. Now, if you'll only catch those nitpicky legal terms when talking to foreign lawyers.
Apple's walled garden may be on fire. It's not a smoking gun, but the semi-laughable class action / antitrust case against Apple's iPod iTunes juggernaut has at least found the attention of more serious tech pundits. On Friday, a subpoenaed Rob Schultz, former iTunes engineer, reluctantly testified that he worked on a project that intended to block 100% of non-iTunes clients and, quote-unquote, keep out third-party players in order to protect Apple's iPod. Though he later said that Apple was simply trying to protect copyright, he admitted that his work led to market dominance for the iPod. The suit, alleging that Apple removed third-party music from iPods between 2006 and 2007, is a bellwether for companies with walled gardens. At stake, a $350 million class action lawsuit that, because this is also an antitrust lawsuit, could be tripled to over $1 billion in damages. A special bonus story: over the weekend, Sony demanded that media agencies stop reporting on the documents that were stolen from them in the largest corporate data breach in the history of IT. For most media agencies, the leaked strips, movies, business plans, and gossip was easy enough to put down, fit only for tabloids. But far more interesting and not so clear-cut a case of tabloidization is the series of emails about Project Goliath that detailed the highly unethical, probably felony illegal efforts to wine, dine, and finance attorney generals into going after Google. While it's possible for Sony to take the high ground against the dissemination of their intellectual property, it's proving far more difficult for them to do so with their now seemingly wholesale subversion of our legal system into an extension of their legal departments. Above all, it is now the very real threat for all corporations and enterprises to do what they need to do as they realize that their IT departments may be chock full of IT data treasures. Now, when we come back, we're going to be jumping into the Enterprise Bites, taking a look at a few deep-diving secrets. But before that, let's go ahead and take a moment to thank the first sponsor of this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. And of course, it's Techserv. Now, let's admit it, these days, so much business is being done on the iPad. businesses are always looking for a force multiplier, a creative way to service their customers, increase productivity among employees, and make more money with the same resources. And in this age, the iPad lets them do just that. For example, the Institute of Culinary Education wanted to streamline the learning process, so they equipped students, faculty, and chefs with the iPad, letting them learn, manage, and teach without the burden of traditional and unwieldy textbooks. A major cable services provider in the Northeast was looking for a better way to give support to customers, so it gave its field technicians, who are the public face of the company, iPads that had been customized to connect those technicians to their customers and create the best possible environment for service. And we've seen what retail companies can do with the iPad, not just as a point-of-sale device, but also as a spot where customers can learn about sales, special offers, and upcoming events. These clients and more have turned to Techserv, the country's largest Apple reseller that sells, supports, and manages the largest iPad deployment projects in the country. Now, if you're considering adding iPads to your business, why not ensure the project's success with an experienced partner? Techserv assists businesses of all sizes to deploy Apple solutions, as well as solutions from Avid, Adobe, and more throughout the United States. No matter if you started deploying iPads already or are just getting started, Techserv can help. And right now, Techserv is offering a complimentary download just for Twiat listeners who are deploying iPads or who are interested in learning more about doing so. Go to techserv.com/Twiat-7sins to get access to the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment and see the common pitfalls that throw companies for a loop during their iPad projects. This complimentary download is available right now just for my listeners at tekserv.com/Twiat-7sins. And we thank Techserv for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Let's get back to the action. Gentlemen, we're going to start this off nice and easy with a non-controversial topic, like, for example, why the United States government should not be selling off its spectrum. We've got an article here from IT consultant Pablo Valerio about spectrum auctions. Now, he's been following these auctions since their beginning. He claims that maybe it's time for governments to stop their current course of auctioning off spectrum to wireless companies hungry for RF bandwidth. Now let's fill in some of the blanks here. Let's look at some of the history. At the end of November, the FCC raised more than $34 billion for 6 blocks or 65 megahertz of spectrum. Now, that was 3 times the reserve bid of $10.5 billion, and the FCC was understandably elated that they were able to raise so much, especially since, as we covered here on Twiat 2 months ago, 1 or 2 of those telcos had been making noise that they did not like the restrictive rules that were being placed on the spectrum auction and that they weren't going to bid on the RF spectrum. Well, of course they did. They didn't really have a choice. But especially since it was just that few months ago that the wireless carriers were hemming and hawing, and now because it's gone for so much money, Pablo is wondering that maybe there's a good reason not to continue the auctioning of spectrum. Now, what exactly does that $34 billion do for the FCC, for the people that they're trying to serve? What kind of war chest does that generate? What do they plan to do with all that cash other than pay internal expenses? More importantly, as he says in his article, as it sells off more and more of its spectrum, will the FCC lose the ability to slap the hands of bad-acting telcos? Specifically, he's looking at the case of Verizon and AT&T that were throttling their customers. The FCC was able to step in and say, you're using pieces of unlicensed spectrum, and therefore, if you do not act properly, we will just cut you off. And they were forced to change their policies. Chee, I want to throw this to you first. This is a curious idea, because we've always been talking how there's a spectrum crunch, how there's demand for more wireless bandwidth available for these carriers so they could do next-generation services. Is there merit, do you think, to the FCC saying, we'll license you to the base frequencies, but we're going to hold back. We're going to lease, not sell, but lease you certain frequencies so that we have a card, a leverage card that we can pull if you stop acting in the best interest of the public.
You know, that makes total sense. You know, why should you sell something when you can lease it? And, you know, I understand, you know, the FCC wants to pay off the national debt. You know, I don't have a problem with that. But leasing makes more sense. I'd like the ability for my government to go and say, you're not being a good citizen, you're doing some nasty things, stop it. And leasing gives you that lever, whereas selling doesn't.
Right. Curtis, there are going to be people who say, but we could do that just in the rules of the spectrum auction. Like, for example, when we had that huge auction, 18 months ago, there were open provisions placed into the auction rules. So if you bought this bid of spectrum, as long as the bid went above a certain amount, you had to offer service to competitors who wanted to use devices in that spectrum. That was spelled out, but it has not been adhered to, and the FCC is very, very hard-strung to enforce it because they have nothing except the rules of the auction. What's your take? Is this a good move? Is this something that you can say, we need this, because otherwise the telcos, once they own the spectrum, have absolutely no interest whatsoever in following what the FCC may or may not say?
Well, I think this is one of those times when what would be best is running headlong into what is politically possible. Because on the one hand, you and Pablo and Chee are all absolutely correct. It would be nice if the FCC could keep some leverage over the telcos, keep a way to influence them, regardless of what they do. The problem is that the FCC, along with the rest of the federal bureaucracy, is under increasing pressure to turn assets into cash. I mean, we're looking at a Congress that has in the past seriously proposed doing things like selling off Yellowstone National Park and trying to lease it back and silly things like that. And if we're looking at people who would seriously suggest selling off pieces of real estate, trying to convince them that they shouldn't sell off these bits of electromagnetic spectrum is going to be a tough, tough sell.
All right. Cheebert, let me bring up another devil's advocate position here. There are going to be pundits who say, no, if you do this, if you only lease the spectrum, then there's not going to be a rush to deploy. I mean, what we want is we want to entice these wireless carriers, these telcos, to actually put money into deploying the backbone system that will support these frequencies. Is that valid? Because I look at this last auction, and already you had AT&T and Verizon that were both saying, if you do this auction by these rules, we will not buy. And they ended up buying. In fact, they ended up buying for 3 times more the reserve price. So is that an actual argument, or is that just one of those ivory tower, this could happen but probably won't?
No, this is Chicken Little. Leasehold land hasn't stopped people from putting up skyrises, shopping centers, and so forth, and putting a lot of money into them. I think as long as they're reasonable and the lease on the spectrum is a reasonably long enough period that the vendors like AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, and so forth can get a return on their investment, why not?
Okay. Well, Curtis, we've got Eric Duckman in the chat room who's saying, wait a minute. The airwaves belong to the people. I mean, it's the air over the United States. Shouldn't the people be determining what happens to that? I mean, and shouldn't it be leased because we never sell it? We just allow a company to use it because they're going to provide the best interest of the people that own the airwaves. But that's not how it works. I mean, we've already sold off huge chunks of spectrum to companies. Yes, there are open provisions, but this gets back to the basic argument, which is there's no real way for the FCC to tell them to follow the provisions unless the FCC has some sort of trump card.
Well, to the first part of what Eric Duckman said, I think a lot of people in Washington would tell you that the people do, in fact, own this asset, and that the people are telling the companies what we want done through the office of the FCC, which is controlled by the people's representatives in Congress. That's the way all of this works. When it comes to selling the spectrum, we have in fact done that, and we have some combination of sold and licensed spectrum as long as there has been a use for it. So for over 100 years now. I think that what we are going to have to find, and what the FCC has been working on for the past couple of years, is some sort of regulatory framework that will allow them to define the spectrum in a way and define the services in a way so that they can regulate it with teeth through the normal regulatory process rather than having to go to the courts in a one-off process every time a rule is violated, or every time, if not a rule, at least some bit of behavior that we say we want is violated. The other thing that we're coming up against is that there are some competing priorities. I mean, which is more important? The openness with which the spectrum is used, or rapid development of technologies? There is some tension there, and what we're seeing is the FCC and a lot of other people trying to figure out which of these behaviors they want to reward the most and which they're willing to allow some slower development in exchange for the others. The trump card, if you will, in all of this is the law of unintended consequences, because the fact is we don't know what's going to happen. The regulators, the companies themselves can make their best guess, but until we actually have the spectrum allocated somehow and have companies starting to use it, we don't know what the hidden gotchas are going to be. And that's where things are going to turn around and bite the regulators and possibly the companies after all of this is already put into motion.
Right. We do need to move on to the next story, but I have to say, I love this idea of selling some base spectrum so that these companies can operate, but then leasing them some of the higher bandwidth pieces of RF spectrum in order to have something that we can go back in 5 years, 10 years, however long the lease is. I mean, can you imagine what kind of wireless infrastructure we would have right now if Verizon and AT&T knew that every 5 years we were going to have a public examination of how well they did by the consumers in the United States who were trying to use the spectrum that legally they own? I think we'd have a very different system. I think we'd have a much better system. I think we'd have a much more competitive system that might rival the world rather than be embarrassed by it. Let's go ahead and move on to the next story. This one is a little easier for us to do. I'm sure that it's not as legally complicated as the auctioning of spectrum. It's Google versus Spain. Yeah, over the weekend, a story broke. You see, the AEDE, which is an association of Spanish newspaper publishers, pushed through a copyright law amendment that many have called the Google tax. The amendment demands that Google pay royalties for the reproduction of news snippets and image thumbnails and search results on Google's Google News service. Now, it should be noted that Google News is simply a search engine. It doesn't cache the stories or serve them to users. It uses a single line of copy and a thumbnail. When users click the story, they are directed to the story on the indexed news site. Now, Germany tried a similar approach back in 2013. They passed legislation that made Google pay royalties to index sites in Germany. However, instead of agreeing to pay, Google said, well, that's fine. I mean, if we have to pay to use snippets, we won't use snippets. They went to just indexing hyperlinks, and traffic to those news sites dropped, plummeted, in fact, fell to zero. So what happened was the publishers capitulated, and they did a workaround. They didn't change the law, but essentially they gave Google a way to circumvent it. Now, the same thing has happened in Spain, except the AEDE put in a provision in the amendment that made it an unalienable right to payment. In other words, there is no way to circumvent this law. There cannot be a private decision, a private agreement made between publishers and Google. Well, now that the law is in place, Google has said, all right, well, we're just shutting down the news service. We don't make any money from it. It's a public service that we did for the people of Spain. But if we now have to pay to index your sites, we just won't index your sites. Well, surprisingly, the AEDE has now come back, panicked, saying, well, no, we want you to force Google to stay open. And in effect, they're going to the Spanish government and saying, we don't want you to change the law, but we want you to force Google to stay in business, even though it's going to cost Google money, and make it a requirement for them to do business in Spain. This is all kinds of crazy. This is all kinds of insane. There's plenty more, but I want to open this up to my co-host first, Chee. This is one of these very strange stories that we're hearing more and more of that seems to be the end result of a widespread anti-Google fever spreading throughout the EU.
Well, what this really is the Spanish government going fishing for money. And keep in mind, this is what governments have been doing to libraries all over the world. When you go into a library and you do searches and you find journal articles and various things, the library is actually paying to get access to those databases. Well, what the governments are saying is, gee, that worked for the libraries because the libraries don't have a huge amount of influence. We're going to go do it to Google. Oops. Now all of a sudden Google's saying, okay, fine, we're going to take our marbles and leave. We don't have to provide this service. No law can say I'm going to run myself out of business. No one in the world is going to be able to support that. What they're trying to do, though, is say, hey, Google, we want you to stay, we want you to do this, but oh, by the way, we want you to pay us to do this. It's like, dude, come on. There's too many taxes already. Let Google do their thing. They're providing a good service to the general public. Back off.
All right. Now, Curtis, we've got people in the chat room like Trey3, and this is actually a very common sentiment. I'm not picking on Trey3, who says, well, I don't have a dog in this fight. And I think that is a very common perception of this whole issue. And not just Spain, but also the similar cases that were raised in Belgium and France and in Germany. This whole idea of, well, it's not my country, it's not something I care about, so why should I care? But there are those of us who are old enough, who predate the internet, who remember when the internet was a place where if you wanted to get to a resource, you had to actually know the IP address of that resource. And you had to know how to search that resource because there was no common search hierarchy. Google and other search engines like it changed that. They made the world's data indexable, searchable. So whenever I hear people say, I don't have a dog, I don't have a pony in this race, it always kind of irks me because what would the internet be like if the simple act of indexing where resources are on the internet would require a payment of royalties?
Well, it would certainly be much different, and it would go against one of the things that has been a useful hallmark of the internet since before there was a World Wide Web. I mean, let's face it, there were search, if not engines, there were search functions available on the internet before there was a web. You didn't have to pay for the results of things like Gopher, Archie, and all of those services that you use to get resources that were available on the internet. Brian's quite right. This is a government in a country that has been absolutely hammered to an extent that we really don't fully appreciate in the U.S. over the past decade, trying to find really any source of revenue. It's also something that is entirely in keeping with the way the Spanish government, and they're not alone in this, views business. You can find similar attitudes towards business in many of the countries, typically along the northern side of the Mediterranean. Italy, Greece, to some extent Portugal, all have similar attitudes about what can be expected from companies that do business there. And the answer is quite a lot. And even if it means that the companies are forced out of a tenable business proposition, well, hey, that's just the cost of feeding the government coffers. And it provides a little bit more money to make people feel good while they are receiving services from the government. There are all sorts of cultural issues here. There are all kinds of legal issues here. But I think what people are finding is that the common complaint by publishers that readers, consumers of information have become accustomed to getting things for free isn't unique to those readers. The companies have become accustomed to getting things for free, the listings on Google and the traffic that those listings provide. You can't put a block on one link in the chain without having consequences that cascade all the way down the chain. In the last bit, we talked about the law of unintended consequences. Welcome to lesson number 4386 in the application of the laws of unintended consequences.
Mike Elgin, over the weekend, he actually posted his thoughts on this story, and he was essentially saying, look, if you look at the pattern, not just with this tax, which we have also, again, seen in Belgium and France and Germany and now in Spain, but also with what the UK is doing with the right to be forgotten, maybe Google pulls out of the EU. Maybe it pulls out of Europe. Maybe it essentially says, look, if you don't want us to do business here, we won't do business here. Now, it kicked off a firestorm, and I think it was intended to kick off a firestorm because it promotes discussion. But a few of the things that came out of that long thread of posts from Mike Elgin's post, which I believe we actually have a link to, is that, Google, maybe it owes something to the people it serve. Maybe it has enough money to pay the fines and therefore it should just take it. Maybe Google expects the world to follow American law. Maybe Google search is now a utility and it needs to act like a utility. Chee, I want to throw this over to you because this is actually an old discussion. When a service like Google becomes so vital, so important, so ingrained, so much of a monolith, I'm not going to call it a monopoly, but a monolith, does it then move from private industry into public service?
Well, I'll tell you, my attitude about this is when you start getting into, am I a utility? For God's sakes, give them the advantages of being a utility. It doesn't feel right to have it both ways. So if Google is going to be utility, let Google actually say carve off a section, an operating portion, so that that portion can act like a utility and then have the rest of Google operate like a for-profit corporation. My feeling is, we need to have a balance here, and I don't think the Europeans are, they're looking at a cash cow and they're going to try and milk it for all they got, but at least give Google some reasons to spend that money. Because right now, it doesn't look like Google's getting a whole lot of advantages to providing that public service.
Yeah, actually, they were getting no advantages. They weren't making profit off of Google News. They don't advertise on Google News. It was just a service that they provided, and the publishers came in and said, we want you to have to pay to provide this free service to our people. Now, I don't want to go as far as saying that, the Europeans just saw a cash cow. That is definitely a legitimate analysis of that. However, again, and Curtis referred to this, there is a cultural understanding that you have to have here where corporations are just distrusted in Europe. It's the complete opposite of the United States, where we tend to trust corporations. We distrust government. And I think we're caught in this weird loop where people just think Google is doing bad things, and so they pass laws to prevent Google from doing bad things, and Google then does something that looks bad, and it just feeds upon itself. Now, this is not the last time we're going to hear of this story. I'm sure it's going to come back because there are many more decisions coming down through the EU that are going to have serious ramifications on how Google does business outside of the United States. So stay tapped. Now, when we come back, we're going to be bringing in a guest, Jerome Levadoux from Recommind, who's going to be talking about Enterprise 101 for startups. But before we do that, let's go ahead and take another break to thank the second sponsor of This Week in Enterprise Tech, and it's Braintree. Now, that's code for easy online payments. If you're a developer or product manager searching for the right payments API, check out Braintree. Braintree's V0 SDK makes it easy to support multiple mobile payment types. That lets you start accepting Apple Pay, PayPal, Bitcoin, Venmo, and all major debit and credit cards with one simple and fast integration. If you're a developer or just looking for an easy way to accept payments, then you're going to wonder how you did without their V0 SDK. It's elegant code with clear documentation. It's only 10 lines of in-app code, and that leaves you ready to run. The code supports Android, iOS, and JavaScript clients. It has SDKs in 7 languages: .NET, Node.js, Java, Perl, PHP, Python, and Ruby. And with that simple snippet of code, you'll be able to accept all the payment types your customers want, even 130-plus different global currencies. Braintree has the best-in-class customer service. If you have a question or problem, with Braintree, you'll always get a live person to talk to. And if you're struggling, Braintree will actually handle the integration for you and walk you through the process. When's the last time you had a vendor try to do that for you? Of course, Braintree knows that it's not enough to have easy-to-integrate code and top-notch customer service. They get that they're offering you financial services and that their security is your security. They're known for their back-end security and merchant protection. Specifically, they know that the best way to safeguard your customers' financial information is to make it so that you don't ever have to have your customers' financial information. They use tokens to secure payment data so real credit card information is never passed on to your servers. That means you can't lose what you don't have. And that makes Braintree the fastest, easiest, most secure way to pay, period. Now, it's no surprise that Braintree is the payments API used by companies like Uber, Airbnb, Hotel Tonight, Living Social, and GitHub. They've made the payments experience in these apps seamless and magical. And now you can have that same magic in your app. Braintree scaled with these companies from early-stage startups to the successful companies that they are today. So you know that they can scale with your business, from processing your first dollar to your billionth, no matter how a customer would like to pay. If you're searching for the right payments platform, check out the Braintree V0 SDK today at braintreepayments.com/twit. Review their documentation. It's simple and concise. Play around in their sandbox. Give Braintree a try with no commitment and test your integration before going into production. And after you integrate Braintree, the first $50,000 in transactions are fee-free. That's braintreepayments.com/twit. braintreepayments.com/twit. And we thank Braintree for their support of Twit. We welcome into the show the CMO of Recommind, Jerome Levadoux. Jerome, thank you very much for being part of This Week in Enterprise Tech.
Hi, it's my pleasure to be here.
Now, Jerome, for the folks playing along at home, can you tell them, in layman's terms, what is Recommind?
Yeah, sure. Recommind is a data analytics company. So we basically use machine learning and artificial intelligence to analyze vast bodies of unstructured information, things like emails, social media data, documents. And where we really specialize is using that data for litigation purpose. So think about large corporations, law firms, governments having to look at large amounts of data for evidence in the context of investigations. And we basically help to transform the way that is done through better analytics and machine learning.
Oh, okay. Now this is a unique product. We don't normally cover services like this on This Week in Enterprise Tech, but essentially what you're doing is you're using the power of big data for litigation, specifically for startups to defend themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Large corporations are sitting on mountains of information. And that information often comes of use when it comes to litigation and figuring out what went wrong. What people don't know is that this oftentimes is a very large cost where you're paying, lawyers, large groups of lawyers to read millions of documents, and this can take months and cost a lot of money. So we try to transform that by making the process a lot faster and simpler, by getting to the key data very quickly, and doing that in a very fast way.
I have to say, you've probably just struck a nerve with most of our audience, because we love covering here on Twiat everything to do with patent trolls, especially when they go after startups who don't have a big legal team, who don't have a mountain of cash that they can throw at the problem. It seems to me that if I now have a service that could do the work of a team of lawyers so that I could find out if the product I'm about to launch has any outstanding patents that may be used against me, this is no longer a luxury. This is something that I should do out of due diligence.
Yeah, it's interesting that you point out this is specifically the kind of work we've done with our customers. There's even a different example which I find fascinating. One of our large customer companies found that having our software was very dissuasive towards patent trolls because they used to be sued, and the cost of doing e-discovery was so high that they would almost always settle, so that they wouldn't have to go through the litigation process. And now that they have this tool, they found that the patent trolls are dissuaded to go after them because they know they can very quickly go to the data and provide the right answers. So it can work also in that way.
Right. And unfortunately, we have covered a few stories here on Twiat about startups with great products or great services that just didn't have enough time to do more than a cursory glance of what might be out there, and then they fell into litigation, and next thing you know, they're gone. Could you give me from start to finish, how a new startup, let's say I've got a 5-person startup, they're working here in the Silicon Valley, they've got some new product or service that they're trying to push out. How would I use Recommind to figure out whether or not I can launch my product without any legal obstruction?
Yeah, well, we actually don't have a service that anyone can go to directly to search on prior IP. But what some of our customers do is basically, they would load documents that are relevant into our technology and use it to figure out if any of what they're doing is infringing on prior art or other patents that are out there. We don't have a open service for any startup to look at that. Unfortunately, not as of today.
All right. I want to bring in one of my co-hosts here, Mr. Brian Chee. We call him Chee, but Jerome. Brian, you spend a lot of time ranting at patent trolls. A service like this, a consultancy like this, what does it do to change the amount of risk you have to put yourself at when you're a startup?
Actually, my big question for Jerome is, can this system be used after the fact? So I've got a startup, and suddenly I've got a patent troll hitting me. How can I go in after the fact and index what I already have so that I can help defend myself against these patent trolls?
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things you have to do when you defend your inventions is to basically figure out, when the idea came up, where it came from, try to find evidence whether you violated any patents or anyone was aware of it. So what our customers do is basically collect all of their data and put it to our engine to figure out, exactly what was the timeline, right? Who invented what? When did they come up with the idea? And getting, the right timeline and figure out what happened when is very critical to proving, your claims on certain IP. So, just getting to the facts is very important there.
Fabulous. I've actually been through the discovery process several times for different organizations, and oh my God, it's painful. So I'm really looking forward to taking a harder look at your product.
Thank you.
Jerome, I want to push the conversation a bit forward because, okay, the big data legal background, that's fantastic. But Recommind is more than just a legal database. One of the things that you do in consultancy is you allow startups, you train startups to deal with enterprises. Now, we know a few things about startups versus enterprises. Enterprises tend to be big. They tend to have a lot of inertia. They tend to have a lot of resources, but it's hard for them to bring those resources to bear on a new project. Startups are the opposite. They're small, they're nimble. They may not have a lot of resources, but they can take the resources that they have and push them in a very specific direction very quickly. One of your consultancy areas of expertise is how we mesh the two together. How do you train startups to deal with enterprises?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a few things to know, or things that we've experienced in our own development as a company. First of all, enterprises can be very hard to navigate, as you know, right? They tend to be very large. There's many different layers to get through. You have to talk to procurement, IT, if you sell technology or software like we do. And navigating through that can be very lengthy and very costly for a startup that doesn't have a lot of resources. One thing that I've found to be very successful is to target line of business buyers. I'm a CMO, right? I buy actually a lot of marketing software. Anybody who is trying to sell to Recommind would have a much better chance selling to me, as I buy tools for my own business. And today, with software as a service and easy ways to consume software, basically any head of a line of business or business executive in a company can buy tools for their own usage and somewhat circumvent the formal procurement process and IT to a certain extent to make the process faster and easier for companies to sell into a larger organization. And so I think that's one of the things I would recommend to smaller companies. Make sure you know what line of business you're selling to and go straight to those guys. We sell to legal in Recommind. Of course, we have to deal with procurement and IT, but legal is clearly our buyer, right? When we go into a company, we immediately try to find a champion that can get us through the process. That's typically the chief legal officer, and we're extremely focused on marketing to those guys and connecting to those guys.
All right, all right. I want to bring in my other co-host here, Curtis. You always have a very unique viewpoint because you deal specifically with executives in the enterprise. There's a certain stigma in an enterprise reaching out to a startup. It happens, but you don't see it an awful lot except during an acquisition. Why is it so difficult for startups to get a toehold in trying to do business with an enterprise?
Well, I think the things that enterprises tend to look for are stability and known performance. And both of those are unproven quantities when it comes to most startups. I think that's why for many startups, and I think our guest might be able to address this in respect to his firm, they look for their very early customers to become reference accounts that they can use to talk with future customers about. And they also may lean on the experience of their key executives outside of the startup. What did they do before? Do they have a career path? Do they have a known track record that would let an enterprise be comfortable in something they're doing now? And I'm curious, are those things that he's had to do to be successful to this point in his firm's startup?
All right. Jerome, I've heard you say that one of the keys for a startup looking to deal with an enterprise, and again, we've already gone through what are the differences in the organization, is for the startup to know what their core strength is, for them to know what their value is, what they bring to that enterprise. What are the typical things that you would see in doing this kind of analysis? What would a startup say, this is what we can bring you, this is what you need from us?
Yeah, I think the previous points around enterprises being very fearful of the risk of dealing with a small company is absolutely valid. And certainly seen it at Recommind and other companies I've worked for. Now, I think if you are a very small company, one way to alleviate that is to have a truly transformational value proposition, right? If you're not just incrementally better than what was before, but if you are providing a massive transformation, a massive improvement over what was there before, I think you will find some enterprises, early movers, people that are willing to take the risk in order to get disproportional competitive advantage. So for instance, I recommend when we first got into the business of legal discovery, we could provide, compared to the competition, improvements of 80 to 90% better, right, than the competition, which means the cost of doing any discovery process would be basically a tenth of what would happen, without having our technology. Now, obviously, that interested a lot of people that said, well, yes, this is a small company, the technology is somewhat unproven, but the potential rewards of dealing with it are so transformative that I would give it a shot. That said, the previous point around, having reference customers is very valid. What happened in our situation is, we first sold into one segment, which was law firms. And we first had one law firm, and then we had 10 law firms, and then we had 100 law firms. And then we found our next segment, which happened to be financial services, and happened the same thing, right? The first bank signed up with us, and then soon enough, we started to have a lot more. So, focusing on getting your early adopters in a given industry, and then leveraging that credibility and those connections to expand your reach is critical. But that said, you always have to, face the reluctance to take risk. And I think having a transformational value proposition and addressing a really serious pain point is key if you want to get those companies to jump.
Right. Curtis, I'm wondering, again, in your unique experience, would there be something that you think Jerome needs to fill in about where startups find their target, their sweet spot?
Well, Jerome, I'm curious with your case. I know that many companies have in mind where they want their customer size to be in terms of either number of users, size of database, annual revenue, whatever it is, depending upon the company involved. What has your company targeted? I mean, are you going after primarily, say, large multinationals, smaller enterprises, or someplace in the middle? And I'll also ask, are the companies that you've been able to work with so far the same companies that you hope to be working with in terms of size and scope in the future?
Yeah, I think with in our industry, and our industry is maybe a little bit unique in the way that we deal with legal technologies. But the size of the customer is not always what matters. It's been more the size of the problem they have. And we find that any corporation that has a lot of litigation, or that that operates in a highly regulated environment is very good candidate for our technology. Now, a fairly small corporation could have a pretty large litigation, or could sit on a ton of data. So it's sometimes hard looking at purely the company to figure out, well, do they have a big problem or not? So we figure out, we look more at patterns, right? What kind of industries are having a specific problem? What kind of companies in what kind of space are facing that problem, and go into the purchasing those pockets or those segments of the industry.
Jerome, that sounds great, but are there some best practices that you could recommend to a startup that, maybe they just didn't have the money to go and do a huge amount of market research, and they suspect maybe they're going to run into problems? What can they do to make it easier to defend themselves?
Can you clarify defend themselves in terms of what?
Well, let's be more specific. Is there something a small startup can do to make it easier or better for you to come in and help them index if they get hit by a court case?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So, preserving your data is key, right? A lot of companies do a pretty poor job of preserving their data even today. So thinking ahead of time around, well, what data you want to keep, where you're going to keep it, is kind of critical. And it sounds kind of a basic things, but data has a lot of value. And a lot of companies, either fall into the camp of companies that keep everything, or don't have a very strong policy around, what they should be keeping. Now, suppose you have IP litigation and you need to prove, prior art or things like that. You better have kept your key records and emails from your key engineers, etc., to prove that you were not in the wrong. So keeping the data is actually typically the best start to be prepared for litigation. And then the rest is pretty straightforward. Our technology can index pretty much any kind of data, any repository. So as long as it's there and we know where it is, we'll find it. Technology has really moved forward a lot in that space, where we can ingest pretty much anything out there, including really old files from really old software versions, things like that.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you all for this fantastic discussion. I'm afraid that we have reached the end of our time for This Week in Enterprise Tech. That's right, you've used up another hour listening to the best dang enterprise show on the planet. That's according to 9 out of 10 startups. I want to thank all of my panelists for being part of the show, starting with you, Jerome. Jerome, could you please tell people where they can find out more about you, about your company, about Recommind, and the services that you provide?
Yeah, sure. Please, it's very simple. Please come to our website, recommind.com. We've got a lot of great content, demos. We also have a really great blog with all the latest and greatest about what's happening in the litigation industry and the e-discovery industry. And the blog is called Mind Over Matters. So please visit us at Mind Over Matters or recommind.com.
Jerome Levadoux, the CMO of Recommind, we thank you very much for being part of this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech.
Thank you.
I also want to thank my co-hosts for being here. As always, they are the bread and butter, the meat and bones, the plastic, and I'm out of analogies. They are the folks who make this show so much fun. Let's start with you, Curtis. What's going on at Information Week Radio that the Twilight Riot should know about?
Well, Padre, we've got a couple of great things going on this week. First, tomorrow, our very own Cheebert will be my guest on Interop Radio, 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. We're going to talk about what software-defined networking really means. I can think of no one better suited to tell us that than Cheebert, and so we'd love to have the Twilight Riot join us for that. I'm also doing a thing Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern over at All Analytics. I'm going to be talking to Jim O'Reilly about the infrastructure of deep analytics. And then, of course, on Friday, we've got Information Week Live, 3 p.m. Eastern, where we talk all about the top stories this week at Information Week. All of those are going to be great. Should be a lot of fun. Oh, and if people want to find Interop Radio, they should follow my Twitter feed at KG4GWH right down here, because that's where I'll have the link to all those shows.
And, of course, we thank Brian Chee, who happens to be in studio this week. Brian, other than learning how to pilot a quadcopter, what's up for you in the next week or so?
Well, learning how to fly a quadcopter badly, but I'm going to solve that because, you know, you really need to watch Padre's show, Know-How, on how to build quadcopters. It changed my mind. I thought quadcopters were very expensive. I thought quadcopters were hard to fly. No, they're not. Anyway, so obviously I'm going to be on internet radio tomorrow, and I am actually hiding right now so that I can finish writing my book.
Yes, we look forward to that. We're gonna see chapters of this soon. Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. I also want to thank everyone here at the studio who makes this show possible. To Karsten, my super producer, to Lisa and Leo for letting me do the show, and of course to my super TD, Mr. Cranky Hippo Brian Burnett. Brian, you've been sitting quietly for most of the show, but I understand there's information that needs to get out of your no-hole, right?
Yeah, especially after what Brian said, Cheebert, by the way, because yeah, we've been having a lot of fun with those quadcopters, and actually you gave me a sneak peek of some of the footage you got over the weekend, and I'm looking forward to showing some people on that on Know-How. So yeah, tune in on Thursdays, 11 o'clock. You can also follow me at cranky_hippo on Twitter, and you'll probably be
corgis.
Yeah, you'll be blitzed by corgis and pictures of my brother Greg's German Shepherd.
Fantastic. Don't forget that you can also find all of our episodes of This Week in Enterprise Tech on our show page at twit.tv/Twiet. If you go there, you'll find not just all of our episodes for download, but also a little drop-down menu where you can automatically have every episode downloaded into your device of choice each and every single week. It's one of the things that we do for the Twit TV Army. Also, don't forget that we do the show live every Monday at 2:30 p.m. Pacific time at live.twit.tv. If you join us live, you get to see the pre-show, the post-show, and all the little foibles that we have to take out because we are human people. And as long as you're going to join us live, why not jump into our chat room at irc.twit.tv. The IRC is right there, right? I see you guys right up there. So if you write to me during the show, I can often include your comments and your questions inside each and every single episode. Again, it's part of the goodness that is Twit. While you're doing that, why not jump over to my Twitter page at twitter.com/PadreSJ. That's at PadreSJ. Follow me, and you'll find out what I do in between episodes of This Week in Enterprise Tech and all the other content I do on the Twit TV network. You'll find out what we're going to be doing. You'll be able to suggest topics for new shows. It's all part of the goodness that is Padre SJ here at Twit. Don't forget that we will not be here next week live. We're actually going to have a best of show, and our next live show is actually going to be this Friday if you are watching live, and if you're watching this on a download from a week from now, it gets confusing. Just check the Twit TV calendar at twit.tv/cal, and you'll find out when we're going to be broadcasting next. Until next time, I'm Father Robert Ballecer, the Digital Jesuit, reminding you that if you want to know what's going on in the Enterprise, just keep quiet.